All right, thank you, Wendy. Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to join you from Johannesburg, South Africa, on my trip here in Africa. So I wanted to have a chance to speak with you this evening about trace mineral supplementation and really the value that it has to the farmer and the vet by improving animal health and productivity. So we'll just jump right in here. Assuming my PowerPoint wants to advance. Okay. So trace minerals are critical to a number of biological processes in the body. Things like copper and manganese are important in the development of skeletal development as our animal grows, in the immune response for things like neutrophils and lymphocytes. Our animals need them for adequate reproductive performance. And then really what all of these trace minerals play critical roles in is things involved in protecting against oxidative stress, so supporting the antioxidant capacity through things like superoxide dismutase or glutathione peroxidase. Now, when we consider the large animal, our ruminant beef cattle that we're talking about this evening, we need to remember that the feeds that we give them, the grass that they're grazing, the corn or the maize that we feed them in the feedlot, all of those feedstuffs actually contain trace minerals. Our problem generally lies in the fact that the concentrations of those feedstuffs for the trace minerals may not actually provide enough for the animal to maintain optimal growth and productivity, and as a result, we've developed supplementation strategies. The other thing that our ruminants really struggle with is a whole host of antagonists that will come from the diet largely and can decrease trace mineral absorption. So things like iron, which is a very strong antagonist to manganese. Iron and manganese actually use the same transporter in the intestine to get into the system. So a high amount of iron will decrease the amount of manganese that gets absorbed. Those next two, molybdenum and sulfur, will both affect copper absorption. I always say poor copper is kind of the poor trace mineral here that really struggles to get into the system. Molybdenum and sulfur form a complex called thiomolybdates, which has a very high affinity for copper. And that copper will be bound to those thiomolybdates in the rumen, and it's not available then for absorption by the animal down the gastrointestinal tract. So both of those can be antagonists to copper absorption. That last one, calcium, is one that you really deal with here in South Africa in particular, with high calcium in your soils. And calcium is a potent antagonist to zinc and can prevent its absorption. So I always like to give this type of figure in these presentations. And what we're looking at here is mineral intake versus performance. So performance is here on the left and bioavailable trace mineral intake across the x-axis on the bottom. And what we're looking at here is sort of when we have the best trace mineral intake, that supports optimal performance for our animals. And so if we get over on the right side of the curve as you're looking at your screen, we can get into the case of subclinical toxicity, where maybe it's not an overt or obvious sign of toxicity, or down to the severe toxicity on the bottom right of the curve, where it's obvious that we're dealing with the toxicity of a mineral. What I really want to focus on today is this left side of the curve, this subclinical deficiency down to this very severe deficiency. So I've dialed in on that part of the curve. It's just flipped around here. And what we're looking at is subclinical deficiency and then clinical deficiency. And what we can see here on our subclinical deficiency is that when we first start to drop below optimum bioavailable trace mineral intake, we start to affect processes like the immune function first. And a lot of times we won't see that in our animals unless they face a severe disease challenge. But maybe a few more animals get sick in the feedlot, or a few more calves at receiving time are ill. And then we drop on growth and fertility. And I always tell producers this is the time where, well, normally my conception rates are 95%, but this year it was 92%, and the next year it's 88%. And those little drops in conception really represent an economic impact to the producer. And so those aren't obviously trace mineral signs of deficiency, but we know these trace minerals like manganese, copper, and zinc, and selenium are all really important in reproductive performance. And then as we get to the bottom part of that curve, that's where maybe the signs of immune function and growth depression are so obvious that it's very obvious that it's a trace mineral deficiency. But unfortunately, that whole area on that slope on the subclinical part of the graph really represents an area of trace mineral nutrition that a lot of times we just don't know that the animal is mildly deficient and could see an improvement in performance if we could improve their status. The other thing when considering trace mineral nutrition for ruminants is to understand the times in our production cycles where we put added stress on these animals. So one of those is obviously weaning. We take that calf away from the cow, we put it on a truck or a boat in some countries and ship it to a new location. We give it a lot of new friends that all come with fun new diseases from their own places that these calves have never been exposed to before, and they don't want to eat, they don't want to drink, and as a result, we don't get adequate trace minerals into them, and they're more likely to suffer from a depressed immune response if they have that disease challenge. Reproduction is another one. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but specifically, we know that these minerals are important for actually getting the cow bred, conception, and then she's also at the end of gestation, that last third of gestation, really not only feeding minerals to herself, but also pumping them into that fetus, accumulating them in the liver, for storage so that that calf can use it after it's born, because mom's milk just doesn't provide a lot of these trace minerals. And they depend on their fetal liver reserves to provide those trace minerals. And then that last one, anytime our animal is mounting an immune response, whether that be after vaccination or needing adequate neutrophil function for sort of that first line of defense, these trace minerals are all important there. So I mentioned previously that our diets do often contain trace minerals, just maybe not always in the adequate amounts that our animal needs. So we've developed supplementation strategies to meet these needs. And so the first one there I've got listed is a complete feed. This perhaps works best for the feedlotter who has options of a feed wagon or a mixer where they can force feed the mineral into the animal as a part of a complete total mixed ration. And that's obviously going to assure adequate intake by the animal because you've forced it to them. That second there would be more for the grazing animal, where you provide minerals in a supplement, maybe with a maize supplement or something like that. And largely we tend to ignore that the forage provides any minerals at all in those situations. And that last one is the free choice mineral, which is kind of an oldie but a goodie that everybody tends to use, where we provide minerals and vitamins in a free choice self-feeding situation, often by the water. The problem that I have with free choice minerals, although we always need to have them available to our animals, is that I have yet to meet the cow who knows how to read the bag label. So when it says that they should eat 4 ounces per head per day for best intake, I've yet to meet the cow that actually goes and eats 4 ounces per head per day. And we tend to forget about the calf, and he's eating 1 or 2 ounces per day, and one cow's eating 8 ounces per head per day, and one cow's not eating it at all. And so what happens is that we have considerable variation in the intake of minerals among our animals, so it's hard to keep them all at a good status level. So beyond the oral sources of minerals, another situation that we've looked at in the United States, the availability of injectable minerals to provide minerals quickly to animals. So some of the advantages versus disadvantages for injectable minerals is that you know that there's a consistent delivery with these injectable minerals where you're putting it into a needle under the skin, and you know that it's getting into the system. It's available to the tissues. We're going to talk about some of the metabolism data here in a minute. And it really helps avoid having to fight through these dietary antagonisms. So copper that goes in through the muscle into the blood didn't have to fight past molybdenum and sulfur and iron to get absorbed. Now, obviously, this represents an additional cost above oral supplementation strategies, so that's a consideration for the producer. And if you don't work it into normal handling times, you could have additional stress at handling. So just want to tell you briefly about the product that we have done some research with in the United States at my facility at Iowa State University, and that is a product called Multimin 90. And it's called 90 because if you add up those concentrations of the elements in it, you'll come up with 90. And so we have 60 milligrams of zinc in our product in the US, and that's a little different than the product available here in South Africa, which only has 40 milligrams of zinc. The manganese, copper, and selenium listed there would all be the same amounts available here in South Africa versus what we have in the United States. So for the purposes of this presentation, I really wanted to focus on three specific time points in beef cattle production where we know that there should be added benefit to making sure our animals have good trace mineral status. So we're focusing on the situation of getting the cow bred, weaning that calf, and receiving him at the feedlot, and then actually his finishing or feedlot performance. So I want to give credit to others who have done this work. And so this first study that I'm going to talk about on the cow side and breeding was conducted at Kansas State University. And Dr. Casey Olson was the lead author on this publication. And this is published in the Professional Animal Science. And you can see the citation listed there. And what these authors did in Kansas State is actually assess the effect of giving an injectable mineral on cows out in a range situation. So we'll talk about that in a second. I want to first introduce the concept of why we think trace minerals are particularly important to the breeding cow. So this is some nice data that was put together in the late 90s from Montana State University. And what we're looking at here is serum copper on the left and liver copper concentrations on the right. And what we can see is here going from pre-calving, liver copper is represented in this dashed line. Pre-calving, she's at about 110 parts per million on a dry matter basis. And during calving, she drops down to about 80. Kind of there where that red arrow is where she's moving towards breeding. You can see that she's down only at 80, 85 parts per million. Now, these are not deficient concentrations of liver copper by any stretch of the imagination, but you can see that she's depleted relative to the other times of the year, like there when the calf is weaned and her status is coming back up. The problem with this is that during that last third, as you can see that curve going from pre-calving to calving, part of the reason it's dropping is because she is putting her mineral, that cow is, into that calf's liver, so that that calf liver can accumulate it and use it later after it's born. Unfortunately, it's pulling down her trace mineral reserves, and we need her to have good status to have good luck with conception and maintaining that pregnancy. So one of the things these authors were interested in is looking at this idea of giving an injection before calving and then also before breeding to see what would happen if you rapidly improve their trace mineral status, if that has any effects on conception or performance. So this was a study done at 2 different ranches in Kansas. And Kansas is sort of in the southern plains in the US and would have a lot of native range where they would have good grass at this time of year in May and June. And we'd go through our summer slump in July and August where the quality drops very quickly. So what they did is they identified 460 cows determined to be pregnant, and then they randomly assigned them to either receive an injection of Multimin 90 at a dose of 1 milliliter per 90 kilos of body weight for these mature cows. And then the controls were injected with physiological saline instead of the injectable mineral. So they did 2 different time points, approximately 105 days before the cows were expected to calve, and then again 30 days before a timed artificial insemination program to look at the response there with improving mineral status. So I just want to jump right into the results here. So what we're looking at here is our item of interest on the left, and then the trace mineral injected cows, the saline injected cows, the standard error, and then the p-value, which we want to be low to tell us if we had significant differences. So we can first see that there was no differences in the percentage of cows that were cycling before timed artificial insemination due to injectable mineral, and that would be based on a progesterone sample. And then on that bottom line, no difference in overall pregnancy, although perhaps a slight numerical advantage to those that received the injectable mineral at 93 versus 89.9% pregnant. But what's really interesting is that line there in the middle where we looked at the timed AI pregnancy response. So what you can see is that about 9% more of the cows, 60% versus 51% of the cows, were pregnant based on the timed AI protocol if they got the injectable mineral. So improving their status over the control cattle allowed more of them to get bred in response to the timed AI program, which was in this case a 5-day co-sync plus cedar protocol. So getting our cows bred to the timed AI protocol as opposed to the natural sire service from the bull out in the pasture means we have an increased opportunity to improve our genetics more quickly, perhaps change the timing of calving, etc. So what these authors actually did is they followed these cows through to the next year, and they looked at when they calved. So this is the subsequent calving season. And what you can see here is that we're looking at the percentage of cows calving over the course of the calving season. And so these authors have split the calving season into three parts: the first 20 days, the second 20 days, excuse me, and the last 20 days. So what you can see in these dark gray bars is that if the animals had trace mineral injection, there's my arrow, had trace mineral injection, had about 77% of the cows that calved in the first 20 days, whereas the saline cows only had about 65% that calved in the first 20 days. So what this means is that cows that had the injectable mineral in this case were more likely to calve early in the season, which means their calves are going to be heavier at weaning. And also, these cows are going to have a chance to recover after calving, go through uterine involution, etc., and be ready for breeding more quickly so that in the subsequent year calving, they can then again hopefully have a calf early in the calving season. So these authors went back and assessed the average age at weaning. So in this case, all of the calves would have been weaned at one time. They were not weaned at different dates based on their age, just all weaned on one day. And so on that one day, the early calving group averaged 186 days of age, and they weighed about 228 kilos. And you can see that as they went to the middle calving group and the late calving group, there's a deficiency of about 10 or 9 kilos per weight group that's lost as we go along. So there's about a 20 kilo advantage going from being a late calf to an early calf. So that heavier calf at weaning, because he was born early, represents a greater potential for a better financial situation for the producer. So if we look at what the cost of Multimin 90 in this case in US dollars to give those two doses, 100 days before calving and 30 days before breeding, costs about $4.80 in US dollars. We have the economic improvement by moving those calving weaning weights to be heavier because those calves were born earlier in the season and they were basically alive longer at weaning, so they were heavier. Accounting for those two doses of the mineral at $4.80, these authors calculated that the producer could net a profit of approximately $12 per head. Now, that is only based on that improved weaning weight, and it doesn't put any value on actually, as I said, getting that cow back in good breeding condition and getting her bred again more quickly the next year. Okay. So the moral of that story, even though those authors didn't look really closely on trace mineral status, is that those cows were out in what I would call extensive grazing systems. They had a lot of hectares to cover, and it's often hard to get those animals to have good free choice mineral consumption, to keep the mineral by the water and things like that to stimulate that, and so sometimes that's a challenge. So I think those animals really benefited from improving their trace mineral status through the use of the Multimin 90 over the saline cows. So the second study I want to show you briefly is a follow-up study to that, and this was conducted by Dr. Mary Janowski and her graduate student Carmen Braschi at the University of Idaho. This was actually the first year of it, just completed last fall, and this work will be presented at our national animal science meetings in the United States this summer. So what they did in this study was actually look at 174 beef cows. These are mostly Simmental and Angus type cows with a variety of age there. And these cows, even though they were in Idaho, which does have rangeland available, were actually raised or grazed on irrigated temperate grasses. So these cows were what you might call fat and sassy. They also had really good trace mineral status. And this university herd has an excellent history of good trace mineral supplementation and intake. So what they did is they split these cows in half and had half of them receive an injection of Multimin 90 at a similar dose to what we mentioned before. And then the other half received no injection, no saline, no further negative control. These authors were also looking at a reproduction study here, and so they divided the cows across a 72-hour or 80-hour synchronization protocol for a co-sync CEDAR protocol. I'm not going to talk about that, but that was a part of this study. So I'm just going to jump right to the results here. And this is looking at the percentage of these cows that were bred based on the timed AI. And you can see that there was no advantage to having the injectable mineral in this particular study, so no difference there. And also no difference in the percentage that were bred based on AI and exposure to the bull basically for 2 months. So in this case, they saw no benefit of using the injectable trace mineral. And I think that this slide probably explains it the best, why exactly they didn't see any benefit. So these authors took liver biopsy samples from these cows. And so what we're looking at here is liver mineral concentrations shown on a dry matter basis. We are showing the control cattle, and then the trace mineral injected cattle, and then the p-value there. And then these authors also have put on here the reference range that they used. So the adequate level here is back calculated from Pohl's 1994 reference, assuming a 35% dry matter in the liver. And you can see that basically within those control cattle, all of them were well within the adequate level for all of these trace minerals based on the Pohl's reference. Now, this liver biopsy was taken approximately 15 days after injection with trace minerals, so 15 days after Multimin 90 injection. And you can see that there's still a significantly elevated liver selenium concentration in the trace mineral injected versus the controlled, with a significant p-value here. No difference in manganese and zinc, and then here just a numerical tendency to have a little higher liver copper in the injectable trace mineral cows. I think the short version of this story is that when these cows had adequate trace mineral status with this university herd, they were in very good body condition score. Um, there was no improvement or no added benefit to utilizing the trace mineral injection in this particular case. So I think the Kansas State study demonstrates that when intake is questionable or when the animals are perhaps mildly deficient, you can see a real benefit in rapidly improving the trace mineral status. And then as shown in the Idaho study here, that when those animals already have really good trace mineral status, it's unlikely you would see a benefit. Okay, so we'll shift gears from the cow side of the story and talk about that calf at the side of that cow. And we know that the destination for that calf is going to be weaning, which is stressful. We're going to put it on a truck. We're going to maybe send it to a sale barn or an auction barn, give it some new friends in a feedlot. And these are all stressful situations. So the next pair of studies that I'm going to talk about are going to focus on this weaning or receiving calf. And this was work that was conducted by Beth Kegley at the University of Arkansas and her graduate student here. And this first study is something that's been published in the Professional Animal Scientist Journal in 2011. And what she was looking at in this study was a set of crossbred heifer calves, lightweight heifer calves, fresh after weaning, that were relatively high stress. They were assembled from a variety of different sale barns, such that they were not all from one genetic source, not all from one farm. They had a lot of new friends in this situation. They brought them into their University of Arkansas research facility, and at the day of arrival, they would have been vaccinated, and then they were randomly assigned to receive one of 3 treatments at processing within a weight group. So in this study, they actually looked at 2 different sources of injectable trace mineral. And so the first one there was a product that was called Injectamin, and you can see that both products were dosed at 1 ml per 45 kilos of body weight. And you can see the concentrations there at 20 mgs of zinc, 20 mgs of manganese, 10 of copper, and 5 of selenium for the first product. And then the second one was Mineral Max 2, and then that's 48 of zinc, 10 milligrams of manganese, 16 of copper, and 5 of selenium. So the biggest difference here in the products are really in the zinc and a little bit of the manganese and copper. That first product from Mineral Technology there, the Injectamin, that one later went on to become Multimin with some slight changes in the concentrations of things. And that second product, the Mineral Max, is actually not even available in the States any longer. And then their last one was a negative control, which received no injection. Okay, so these heifers were fed a receiving diet for 55 days, and this would have been a cracked maize-based diet. So what we're looking at here is the average daily gain per performance of these stressed heifer calves. And where it says 1, 2, and 3 on the bottom of this graph here, it should say this is the first 14 days, so 0 to 14, average daily gain. This is 0 to 28, average daily gain. And this is 0 to 55 days, average daily gain. So I'm really just going to focus here on these last two. We'll just focus here on the 55-day performance for our young ruminants here. And so what you can see is that there was an advantage to either of the treatment groups, these heifers, that got the injectable mineral over the control group for average daily gain. So if they got a rapid improvement in their trace mineral status at arrival, their performance in this 55-day period was improved over those that did not receive anything. So I'm not showing you any of their dry matter intake in these heifers, but you can see that that improvement in average daily gain translated to an improvement in gain to feed. This is their feed efficiency, and we want a bigger number. So this is the kilos of gain per kilo of feed that they consumed. And again, we can see that the control cattle performed more poorly. They were less feed efficient with their resources compared to either of the treatments that got the injectable mineral. So I think this slide, looking at the bovine respiratory disease incidence, probably explains the previous two slides. And that is that over the 55-day performance period with these highly stressed heifers, you can see as we go across there that the heifers that received the injectable mineral from either source were more likely to be more healthy through this study. They were less likely to be sick and less likely to need to be treated with a second antibiotic or even a third antibiotic in these animals. And so you can see that here, less than 10%, or maybe about 10%, treated with a third antibiotic if they received an injectable mineral, and over 30% got a third antibiotic treatment if they did not have an injectable mineral. So what happens is when you have animals that have greater incidence of illness, such as BRD, we have to treat them, we have to put antibiotics into them, and that represents a cost to the producer. So just some economics based on the actual results from this study. You can see that the antibiotic cost in US dollars per calf goes from about $8 or $9.50 for the animals that had the injectable trace mineral versus over $13 US in the animals that received no injectable trace mineral. And that was a highly significant difference. So much more money for antibiotic costs going into the cattle that did not get an improvement in their trace mineral status to begin with. And then the next line also represents, some potential income for this producer. At the end of 55 days, if they got the injectable mineral, they weighed about 260 kilos and about 10 or 11 kilos lighter at 249 if they only received or had no treatment. So what we did here was actually produce a calculator based on the results that were significant in this study, which in this case was the improvement in average daily gain, final body weights, and the less amount of antibiotics necessary to treat those calves when they were given either of the injectable minerals. So, my audience this evening is mostly vets, and so this is preaching to the choir, but you understand that if we have an improved immune function in our animals, and I mean an improved, not necessarily a rampant immune response, we don't want that out of control, it means that we didn't have to treat the animals as much. They're less likely to lose weight due to illness. They're going to stay on feed. And I'd much rather have the nitrogen or other things that I'm feeding that animal go to support weight gain than to go to cytokines or immune function. So based on this calculator, looking at significant values from this study and recent US prices, a return on investment from the use of the injectable mineral was calculated at approximately 10 to 1. Okay, so kind of the moral of that first study is when the heifers were stressed, when there was a stressful situation, there was an obvious and significant economic benefit to rapidly improving the trace mineral status of those heifers. So these heifers thought, or these authors thought, oh, this is good stuff. This is a great thing. We need to do this with all of our calves. Why wait until they show up at the feedlot and they're a stressed mess? Let's go give it to the calves while they're still on the side of the cow. So in this study, these same authors went back And they're actually, this is published in some of the extension publications from the University of Arkansas, shown there. So what they did is they used their university cow herd. So these were Gelbvieh Angus crossbred calves. And they went and while these calves were still at the side of their dam, approximately 28 days before weaning, they went and randomly assigned them to receive either no injection, so no saline, no injection for control, or an injection of the Multimin 90, as I showed at the beginning of the presentation, at a dose of 1 milliliter per 45 kilos of body weight. And so they gave these injections. Then 28 days later, they would be weaned. They were group housed in a single lot for 42 days to get them sort of bunk broke and used to the feedlot. Then they put them out on a wheat pasture to graze for 155 days, again as a single group. Then they put them on a truck and drove them over the state line to Oklahoma and housed them in a feedlot and finished them there for 167 days. So basically on day 392, the very end relative to injection, these animals were harvested, and these authors measured a variety of performance and carcass characteristics. So I'm not going to show a lot of the data because I think this slide is going to tell it all. This is looking at the body weight change and body weights of these calves over time. And so what you can see is that basically the control cattle, shown in blue, and the injectable mineral, shown in black, really don't ever differentiate each other along this entire study. And so essentially the moral of this story here is when these calves had relatively small amounts of stress, they were fence line weaned, they were group housed, they went on to a feedlot together, they were housed in pens together. You know, they kind of did all the things that we tell producers to do to minimize the risk to improve performance. These animals had good status, they had always had free choice mineral available to them, and as a result, there was no noticeable benefit of using the injectable trace mineral in this study. So when the animals have minimal stress and good initial status, based on their exposure to mineral that their dams had had and that they had had in the pasture, there was no detectable benefit to using the injectable mineral here. Okay, so far we've seen the story of improving the status to see a response and helping an animal deal with stress to potentially see an economic benefit here of rapidly improving trace mineral status. My last story here is going to be about sort of the end of this calf's life, and that's his time in the feedlot. And this is going to be actually some work that we did at my facility at Iowa State University. I want to acknowledge my graduate student, Olivia Genther, who did all of the heavy lifting in all of these projects. And so we're just going to talk about one project here because we actually built in a control within this, and you'll see that in just a second. This is reported in 2 papers in the Journal of Animal Science from February and June of this year. Okay, so looking at the experimental design, we used 40 Angus type steers in this study that weighed about 300 kilos at the start of the study. And you might be thinking that 40 doesn't sound like very many, but we actually had these steers fed in a barn that allows us to measure individual intake of each steer. So each steer is an experimental unit. So this study was a 2x2 factorial. And the first was we were interested in changing the status of these calves. So we bought these steers from a single genetic source, a single farm from a sale barn, and we stratified them by weight and divided them into these 2 treatments. So the one shown in yellow, half of the steers received a growing diet. This was a maize silage-based diet, and this diet was supplemented with copper, zinc, manganese, and selenium at what our NRC would recommend for trace mineral supplementation. So that would be 0.1 for selenium, 30 for zinc, 20 for manganese, and 10 parts per million for copper. So that would be on top of the diet. That box shown on the red, that was our deficient diet. So we wanted to try to cause at least a mild trace mineral deficiency in these calves. And so what we did is we fed them the same maize silage-based diet, but we did not supplement those 4 trace minerals. So the only of those minerals that they got was just what was provided by the feedstuffs. And then we provided 2 dietary antagonists. We fed molybdenum, 5 parts per million of molybdenum, to antagonize the copper, to drop that status down. And we also fed 300 parts per million of iron to potentially antagonize the manganese and hopefully drop down that manganese status. So we fed these diets for 90 days. So this is a growing phase diet, depletion diet for 90 days. Then we went in and took liver biopsies on all these steers. We got their mineral analysis and we stratified them to their next treatments based on their liver status, so that I didn't randomly assign all of the really high liver copper calves to one treatment versus another. So after we had assessed their status and decided which treatments they were going to come on later, we put all of these calves on a truck, on a semi, and we drove them around the state of Iowa for 20 hours. So this was in July, and it was very, very warm. It would have been probably 37 to 38 degrees Celsius. It was very hot, big heat wave. And the truck driver shows up that morning to pick up the calves, and he comes to me and he says, "Okay, do you have the health papers?" And I said, "No, I don't have health papers," because I didn't even think about getting health papers. So since we have no health papers for these steers who are now supposed to be trucked for 20 hours to induce stress, they can't cross the state line. So instead of taking my magical path up through Minnesota and all these other places for 20 hours, they got to drive around the state of Iowa and see a lot of corn for 20 hours. So these steers were trucked for 20 hours. They were arrived back in the feedlot. We put them back in their pens and let them rest for about 24 hours to eat a little bit and rehydrate. And then we assigned them, as we had stratified based on the liver stores, to one of two treatments. So within the adequate diet, half got saline injection and half got a Multimin 90 injection at a dose of 1 milliliter per 68 kilos of body weight, which is a little bit different dose. That's because these steers were over 12 months of age. So based on that dose, this is the 1 mil per 68 kilos of body weight. And then same split within the deficient diet, where half got saline and half got Multimin. Okay, these steers then went through a 90-day repletion period. And it's important to note that once they got back off the truck and during this whole 90-day repletion period, all of these calves were on the exact same diet, and that was a trace mineral adequate diet. So Multimin is specifically labeled to only be a top-up or a way to rapidly improve the trace mineral status of the animal for these 4 trace minerals. It's not meant to replace their oral supplementation programs, and it's really important, it's critically important that producers continue to provide oral supplementation of these minerals and the other minerals and vitamins to the animal. So that was provided to all of these animals through the whole 90-day repletion period. Okay, so we'll jump right into the performance results here. So what we did in this study is we had ended our depletion period with double weights of these calves on days 84 and 85. We put them on the truck and shipped them from day 89 to 90, and then took double weights again to start our repletion period on day 91 and 92. And on the morning of 92, they would have got their injection of either saline or Multimin. So we took those double weights and sort of looked at what was the performance in that interim high stress period that included the shipping event. So this graph is a little bit backwards to look at, but essentially what we're looking at here is the average daily loss, because during that period the animals all mostly lost weight, not gained weight. And you can see that when the animals were on the trace mineral adequate or the control diet for the 90 days or so before shipping, they lost less weight, a little over 1 kilo per day for that 6-day period, as opposed to the trace mineral deficient calves where they lost more weight. I also want to point out right now that even though we fed no trace minerals to those cattle that were on the deficient diet, and we fed them molybdenum and iron as antagonists, we really only depleted their status to what I would call mildly deficient. We did not have any severely deficient animals in here. So even just a mild deficiency resulted in them not dealing with the stressful event of shipping as well, and they lost more weight during this period. So I think that data is at least somewhat explained by this figure, and this is looking at the amount of feed, the dry matter intake, that these calves consumed during this whole 90-day period after injection. So this is repletion, everybody's on the same diet, but we're showing the data split out here based on their previous diet. So if they've had been grown during the depletion period on the adequate diet, they're shown in blue. If they have been grown on the deficient diet, they're shown in red. So this is really interesting because at this point, for this entire graph, these cattle are all on the exact same diet. They're eating the same diet with trace minerals. And yet what you can see is that their previous trace mineral status has this sort of lingering effect on their dry matter intake, where all the way out through week 3, post-injection after shipping, here shown with the asterisks, that means that these are all significantly different. So at week 1, week 2, and week 3, and then again even a couple weeks later, the control cattle are eating significantly more feed than the deficient. So one of the things we noted is that if the cattle had good trace mineral status before shipping, they went back on feed within 1 or 2 days in the feedlot. Whereas if they were deficient, they took about a week in the feedlot before they reached the level of intake that they had prior to shipping. Now, the other thing I should point out is I mentioned it was very hot during shipping, but we had about 3 weeks here where it was very warm. So I think we had some additional heat stress here. The animals didn't eat quite as much. So I think having that good mineral status before shipping really, helped a lot to helping them deal with the fact that they weren't eating as much and not getting as much intake at this time. So let's look at the effect of using this injectable mineral and what it does to the actual trace mineral stores and enzyme activity in these animals. So what we're looking at here is liver copper concentrations in milligrams per kilogram of dry matter. Whenever you're looking for diagnostic value out of any kind of liver information, if at all possible to dry the samples before you get them tested for mineral analysis, or if you have a dead animal that you're going to be doing a post on, and you do a mineral analysis on wet tissue, take another chunk of it and throw it in the oven to get a dry matter on it and back calculate it, because not all liver and not all parts of the liver have the same amount of moisture. So it's really not as accurate to back calculate to dry matter. So we take biopsies on these live animals, dry them first, then acid digest them and do the mineral analysis. Okay, so we took liver biopsies on these calves, like I mentioned, about 20 days before shipping, and then 8 days after injection with either saline or multimin, and then 15, 30, 60, and 90 days post-injection, and then they would have been harvested basically on day 92 or so here. So what we're looking at in the blue is the cattle that were grown up or depleted initially on the adequate diet, and the dashed line indicates that they received multimin. The solid line indicates that they received saline. So you can see that if they receive multimin, now keep in mind again, through this entire graph, all of these animals are on the same trace mineral adequate diet. Yet we see this rapid increase in trace mineral status here with an increase in liver copper in the control cattle. And that actually statistically maintains out through day 30. By day 60, it's not different from saline, but it still is at day 30. So somewhere between day 30 and day 60, we lose that storage effect. And I don't know if it's day 31 or if it's day 59 because we don't have a sample in the middle. What's really interesting is if you look in the red here, this is the cattle that were grown or depleted on the deficient diet. Again, dashed being multimin and solid being saline. You can see that these cattle are actually kind of decreasing here a little bit with the solid red, and the dashed red multimin significantly elevated over saline within the deficient treatment through day 30. They maintain a numerical increase at day 60, but that's not significantly different there. So it's similar to the control. But what's interesting is that that magnitude of increase between the solid line and the dashed line is different depending on the color. So within the blue line, there's a rather large increase. So even though they had good copper status here, they still had good capacity to store that copper from the injection and keep it for later, for sort of a rainy day. But within that red, you can see the deficient cattle did not accumulate the liver copper as much. And my hypothesis here is that if I am deficient in liver and copper, I don't need to put it into the liver for storage because copper doesn't really function in the liver in storage. Copper needs to be in enzymes like superoxide dismutase or lysyl oxidase or things like that. So I think in these deficient calves, rather than storing it, they're immediately sending it out to these enzymes for use in these different metalloenzymes that require copper. So looking at liver selenium here, again, we can see a very similar response. The dashed lines being the multimin injected, where we see an increase in liver selenium in both the control cattle and the previously deficient cattle, where we are improving the liver selenium in these cattle with the injectable mineral over the saline. And similar to copper, that maintains its significant improvement in liver selenium with multimin 90 through day 30, and then by day 60, it's gone back to be similar to the saline cattle. We didn't have a diet by injection effect here with zinc, so I'm just showing this as an effect of the injectable mineral. And so in here, the orange is showing those cattle that got multimin 90 or the injectable mineral, and the green is saline. So looking at liver zinc, we can see that 8 days and 15 days post-injection, there's an advantage where we've got a statistically greater amount of liver zinc in those cattle that got the injectable mineral over those that had saline, so showing an improvement in status. And this data always kind of surprises me. If you would have asked me before the trial if we would see any increase in liver zinc, I would say it seems really unlikely because zinc is involved in like 300 metalloenzymes. So I just find it almost surprising that the liver even wants to keep any of that zinc, because I think it's just so much is going to quickly get sent out to all of these many enzymes that require zinc because there's so many of them. So I think it's really hard for us to have one specific tissue or enzyme to look at for zinc to assess the status of an animal because it's involved in so many things. Just want to show a couple slides here on manganese here, the last one. So this is actually the only ones I've shown for the plasma. So this is looking at plasma manganese concentration. Plasma manganese is very, very low. It's very regulated. And for the most part, plasma trace mineral concentrations are a terrible diagnostic indice. With the exception of selenium, which can be okay in the plasma sometimes, most of these are just so tightly regulated by the body. They're just designed to quickly move things to the liver to be either stored or packaged and sent out to enzymes or excreted. And so we don't see that these concentrations after injection stay elevated very long. So you can see here with plasma manganese that it quickly elevates at 24 hours or 1 day post-injection. It's back down to baseline by day 8. I'm betting that if we would have measured 2 days post-injection, it would have been back down to baseline. And that's just in part because plasma manganese is so low, it just doesn't move very much. But what we want to see is not have that plasma manganese accumulating. Rather, we want to see that manganese going to support the enzymes that need it. And so one of the most critical manganese-dependent enzymes is something called superoxide dismutase in the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, we've got lots of oxygen and lots of superoxide anions and oxidative stress occurring. So this is one of the few antioxidants that can work in the mitochondria. And so manganese superoxide dismutase, in this case, we measured it in the red blood cell lysate that we collected. And we can see that the enzyme activity over the course of that whole 90-day repletion period after injection is significantly elevated in the multimin cattle over the saline. So we're seeing the manganese not go into an enzyme, which is what we want it. We want it to go to be used in the system and not just, accumulating someplace along the way. So the last few slides that I have here are regarding what happened after we changed these animals' trace mineral status. And so I think that this slide does a nice job of showing the benefit that we can have to rapidly improving the trace mineral status of our beef cattle if they have a need for the minerals. So if they have even a mild deficiency, we see an improvement in performance. So if we start with the left-hand side of the graph, this is looking at average daily gain of these cattle over the whole 90-day repletion period. These cattle were on a finishing high maize type diet during this time. And what we can see is that the control cattle there in the solid blue line that got multimin versus the control saline with sort of the blue hashed lines did not differ in average daily gain during this finishing period. So if they had good mineral status before shipping, before injection, no real benefit here in average daily gain. However, if we look at the red bars on the right side of your graph, we can see that the cattle that got multimin had significantly greater average daily gain, improved performance over those that got saline if they had a mild deficient status of trace minerals prior to shipping. So we saw an improvement to using the multimin at sort of receiving here in the start of the finishing period and improving their average daily gain. Now I'm not showing the data here, but this translates as well to an improvement in feed efficiency, where actually we saw a tendency for improved feed efficiency across both the control cattle and the deficient cattle if they got multimin, so a little bit more efficient there. So in some parts of the world, quality grade is maybe not as big of an emphasis for the beef cattle market, but certainly in the United States, our producers get an economic incentive to improve their quality grade. They can qualify for premiums such as certified Angus beef and things like that. And so I think this is probably one of the most interesting findings that we had in this study. And so this is looking at the marbling scores or the intramuscular fat of the muscle in these cattle after harvest. And we're looking at two different kind of ways of looking at the data here. So we'll start with the one on the left. And what we saw is that if the cattle were grown on that maize silage-based diet during the depletion period on a trace mineral deficient diet, they actually had a depression or a lesser marbling score than if they had trace mineral adequate status or nutrition available during that growing period. And that's really interesting because that's a period, those calves weighed, 300 to 400 kilos during that time. And in our production system, we tend to sort of ignore that growing calf. We don't think that maybe marbling's happening as much there. This is clearly suggesting that trace minerals are important in supporting the marbling in these animals. So if we shift to the right side of the screen, this is really focusing in more on shifting their trace mineral status during the finishing period, during the high maize finishing type diet. And so what we can see here is that regardless of whether they were grown on the control or the deficient diet, if they got multimin 90 at the start of the finishing period after shipping, we had a significant improvement in marbling score. So this is really a tale of sort of oral supplementation on the left and injectable supplementation on the right on top of good oral supplementation, where we can see that trace minerals seem to be affecting the quality grade of the marbling of these animals. So the last one here is looking at ribeye area, and so this is going to be a factor that will affect the lean meat yield of these animals. And so no effect of previous diet for ribeye area data here, but you can see that the animals that got multimin, again, irrespective of whether they were raised on a control trace mineral adequate or trace mineral deficient diet, the multimin 90 cattle had larger ribeye areas at harvest. So again, we're seeing some interesting effects of trace minerals on improving not only fat and marbling, but also perhaps protein synthesis or maybe a depression and degradation here as we're seeing an improvement in ribeye area. So in this study, we kind of had the controls built in. When our animals had adequate trace mineral status, they had slightly improved marbling scores, but otherwise saw no real benefit of injection, resulting in no particular return on investment. And so I actually went back and used specific hot carcass weights from our study results, and actually the ones that had control during the depletion period and then got multimin had just slightly heavier hot carcass weights that actually paid for the cost of the multimin 90 injection, so it was essentially a break even. But if we look at the steers that were grown during the depletion period on the deficient diet and had just what I call a mild deficient status, we had better average daily gains, larger ribeye areas because a lot of that result is driven by that group, and improved marbling, all of those within that group when we use the injectable trace mineral or multimin 90 here. So I calculated that based on those calves having about 11 kilos more carcass to sell versus the deficient plus saline cattle. And that resulted in an improved carcass value of about so 103% basically of the saline cattle. Okay. So just sort of to summarize what we've talked about this evening, I really want to emphasize how important trace mineral nutrition is to help our animals perform optimally. And I think optimally is an important word. It's not maximal. We have to work within the resources available to our producers and to our animals, but we want to help them meet their genetic potential. And I think adequate trace mineral nutrition will help them perform best and also maintain good health. Unfortunately, our poor ruminant and trace mineral metabolism face many challenges to maintaining that good status. So we have a variety of dietary antagonists such as iron, molybdenum, sulfur, calcium, things like that. And a lot of times we can't just look at our animal and say clearly that animal is copper deficient. They may have a mild copper deficiency that could see a real improvement in performance if we could improve that status. We know that stress will influence trace mineral requirements, whether that be the low dry matter intake of a newly received calf, and so you have to feed more or give minerals in a different way to get them into the system because they're not eating as much. And there may be other interactions with stress through things like ceruloplasmin as an acute phase protein, which requires copper, and other things that might be affecting trace mineral requirements. So I think that using the injectable minerals based on the studies I've presented this evening, using those injectable minerals in addition to a good oral supplementation program can be a good strategy for the producer and the veterinarian to utilize to ensure good status in these animals. And if you have stressed animals or even mildly deficient animals, at least based on these studies, there certainly seems to be an economic return on investment due to the improvement in animal performance and or the improvement in animal health. So with that, I will be happy to entertain any questions that anybody might have.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a great presentation. We've had a few questions already waiting for you in the question box. Just a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions, do please type them into the question box on the right hand side of your screen. There's a GoToWebinar control panel. Just type them into there and I'll try and get through as many as I can this evening. And just to thank again Virbac for sponsoring this webinar. And if anybody would like to hear more from Virbac or contact them directly, I'm just about to pop Louisa's email address into the chat box so that you can contact them directly. That's Louisa from Virbac. Her email address has just been sent to you in the chat box. So if you want to contact her directly or even send her a little thank you email, her email address is in the chat box there. So thank you again, Virbac. Let's have a look at these questions. Here we go. Okay, the first question that we have for you, Stephanie, is please explain the concept of mineral supplementation, oral and injected, in organic versus inorganic form. Does the organic form really have an advantage? According to Suttle and Neville, the organic form does not have an advantage over the inorganic form.
Okay, that's a great question. Do I have that slide on here? I'm sure I do. I do. Hold on. There it is, right there. I always get this question, so I came prepared. Hopefully people can see that. So that's a great question. And Suttle definitely does not believe in organics, but he might have a little bit of a bias there. I think the short version is that some people have good scientific evidence, good controlled studies where they've seen an improvement in bioavailability with organic chelated minerals versus inorganic. But I think so much of it largely depends on what the rest of the diet looks like. So if there's antagonists, some things might have advantages by, if they don't become as soluble in the rumen, they're less likely to have that antagonist. But a lot of times, just because it's chelated doesn't mean that it's necessarily not going to go into solution in the rumen and be available for that antagonist. The real problem we have with chelated minerals is that it's all company-sponsored research. So one person does it against an inorganic, and nobody's really done a good job of comparing them across each other. I would say that some of the products out there have good scientific data that say that they're at least slightly more bioavailable than inorganics. And in that case, you might be able to supplement a little bit less of them relative to an inorganic, but it's all going to come down to the economic, price difference. In terms of the injectable minerals, I can tell you that my feeling is that if you need to rapidly improve their status, we've shown that in 3 or 4 studies now. Others have seen that, and that is that the injectable mineral gets into the blood. It very quickly, within 10 to 12 hours or so, it's moving out of the blood. It's moving into the liver. Once it's in the liver, that's sort of the storing clearinghouse for these minerals, and they can be packaged and sent out to enzymes, and some of it's going to go out to the feces too. I mean, that's just the nature of it. It's not all going to be used. So hopefully that answers the question to some extent, dancing around it a little bit, but there haven't been a lot of direct comparisons with the chelates, unfortunately.
That's an excellent, very comprehensive answer, so thank you very much, Stephanie. We have another question, if I may keep you on the line for a little bit longer, Stephanie. Here we go. Is there a difference between supplementing orally with cattle receiving a continuous intake of TM versus injecting it at strategic times in cattle with subclinical deficiencies?
Can you read the first part of it again?
Certainly. Is there a
Yeah.
difference between supplementing orally with a cattle receiving a continuous intake of TM versus injecting at strategic times?
Yeah, so I think the value of, we always need to strive to have a good oral program in front of our cattle all the time. I think the benefit to using the strategic supplementation with, 2 or maybe 3 times a year on the cow herd, for example, with the injectable, is that we've got these known times of stress and we can rapidly get it into the system, which means the cow and the calf can benefit from that. So, what I really like on the cow herd side is that idea of 6 to 8 weeks before calving because she gets the benefit and the growing calf in the uterus gets it, and then 30 days before breeding. I think that's where the data are strongest right now to say that that's the potential for improvement.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephanie. If anybody has missed any part of a presentation or wants to go back over it, it is being recorded. We will get my editing person to do his magic on it, and it will be available to watch hopefully within 48 hours. So we will email everybody with the link to watch the recording. So don't panic too much making notes, or if you feel you've missed a bit, there will be the recording available. We will email everybody with access details so that you can watch that recording. Again, that is with great thanks to Verback and also great thanks to Stephanie for her time this evening and giving this presentation. I think we've just had one other question sneaked in here. Do you have time for one more question, Stephanie?
Sure.
Excellent. Let me have a look. And the question is, can you cause toxicity, selenium, by supplementing orally and then giving the 2 strategic injections as well?
That's a good question. I think of all of the elements in the injectable mineral, that's probably the one that needs to be watched the most closely. And I think that it's something that producers need to be aware that it's not a program where you want to use, for example, 2 products that have injectable selenium. You would definitely want to avoid that. That liver does have an ability to accumulate selenium. I think what we've noticed with our injectable mineral data when we've just got zero point 0.1 or zero point 0.2 in the diet in addition to the injectable mineral, which would be very normal, we see it increase very quickly, but it only stays there for a few hours. It comes back down. So I don't think we're having liver damage or anything from that short time of peak. But a producer needs to be aware that it's not a good idea to be feeding a selenium-enriched yeast and an injectable mineral and an injectable selenium and vitamin E product or something. They need to be very aware to not use multiple selenium sources, excessive sources.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I think that's it for questions, unless anybody is a quick typer and can get one in quickly before we end. But thank you so much for your time this evening, Stephanie. It's really been a great presentation, and thanks again to Verback for sponsoring this webinar. Without them, we can't get all this free great CPD out to you, so it really is great to get the webinar sponsored, and great to get such a fantastic speaker as well. So thank you very, very much, Stephanie, for your time this evening.
Thank you.
And no, that's it for questions. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for attending. Thanks for the sponsorship. Thanks for a great presentation, Stephanie. And I'm really pleased we've had our first large animal webinar, and hopefully it's going to be the first of many. If we can maybe persuade you to come back in the future sometime, Stephanie. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night, and we will email you with details of how you can access the recording. Bye-bye for now.